Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I am Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, and I'm joined here in the studio by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Barber, and we both serve on the faculty of the Augustine Institute's Graduate School of Theology. And we're delighted to have this chance to spend some time with you talking about the third episode of the third season, which has the title, Physician, Heal Yourself.
Yeah, this is a fascinating episode that really draws us into an important episode in the Gospels. And we see it especially in the Gospel of Luke, but let's just set up what's going on. The disciples have been sent out to perform their initial apostolic ministry, and Jesus goes to Nazareth. And there we find that his fame has spread, and this poses difficulties for people there. And there's a real poignancy, I think, in thinking about what it would have involved for Jesus to have gone off, performed lots of miracles, to become well-known, and then to go back to Nazareth, as we read in the story here. But even though there's a lot of thick emotion in this story, there's some humor as well.
Yeah,
there's one scene I really like.
Yeah, let's take a look at that scene. This is one of the things I think The Chosen does really well. So let's take a quick look at a scene.
Cain, Abel. Oh boy.
So this is one of the things where I feel like this is some of what The Chosen does best. You know, little details, biblically inspired, humorous. And I think in this scene, you mentioned how there's so much poignancy in this moment, in this episode of the series. And one of the things that makes it so poignant, I think, is that on the one hand, you have Jesus is at home, right? And so home is home, right? And so he has Cain and Abel, his sheep there, his familiar place where he used to sleep, we assume, right? And so there's a part of us that you always, I think, relate to home in a certain way. And yet, as we're going to see, home, Nazareth, is also, it's building towards being a site of rejection, you know? And so the tension there and the contrast is really quite powerful, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And so the episode takes us into a couple of gospel stories. One is from the Gospel of Mark, and here we have Jesus going back to Nazareth. We read, he went out from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And when it was the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. Here we've got this on a slide there for you. Many heard him and were astonished, saying, where did this man get all this? And what is this wisdom given to him? And what are these deeds of power done through his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Simon and Jude? We've talked about the issue of the brothers and sisters of Jesus in previous commentary. Are not his sisters here with us? And they were scandalized by him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house. And he could not do any deed of power there. He couldn't do any deed of power except
That's right.
that he laid his hands on a few of the infirm and healed them. And so here we have in the Gospel of Mark this scene of Jesus going back and trying to do what he's done elsewhere in his hometown. At the end of the story, we read, and this, we go back to the slide there, Mark 6, and he marveled at their lack of faith, and he went about teaching in the surrounding villages. So here we have a short little episode from Mark's gospel telling us about Jesus's return home. And of course, you see some of those themes, some of the ideas here from Mark in the Chosen episode. One thing that is important to note is that the lack of faith impedes miracles.
Right.
That's really important in the gospel story, is that faith is sort of like the gateway toward the experience of the miraculous. And we experience that in our own lives as well, right? Faith is what opens the door to our experience of Christ and the transformation he can bring about in our lives. And then we get a more detailed account of what happened to Jesus at Nazareth when we get to Luke chapter 4. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about what we see in The Chosen.
Right. So the momentum in this episode is clearly towards a kind of confrontation and ultimately rejection, right? But the setup for that is really nicely done in a lot of ways, I think, where Jesus comes home to Nazareth, and we have a scene where Jesus is there with his mother, right? And then the following day, they have the Rosh Hashanah celebration with folks from Cana, old childhood friends.
Right.
And so through all of this, we have a kind of setup and beginning of driving both momentum, but then also kind of contrast, I think, you know, the positive coming home friends and then the rejection.
Sure, and it is helpful to think about what it would have been like for Jesus to have gone back after he had developed a reputation for performing miracles elsewhere. You know, obviously Jesus grew up with lots of different people. There were people in his hometown he hadn't seen in a while. The Chosen does get you thinking about these gaps in the biblical narrative that, you know, you don't often reflect on.
Yeah. I think at the same time, right, there are some challenges that we see in how Jesus is portrayed. I mean, it's just challenging to portray the Son of God, right? But we see a kind of, I think we at least feel, you know, a decided emphasis on showing Jesus's limitations. So, for example, I want to show you a clip, you know, where Jesus doesn't know what happened to sort of the local dog in the town. Let's take a look.
I saw that the brown dog wasn't at the city gate when I got there. Did something happen to him?
He died several months ago.
That would explain it.
And so then after that, we have another scene where Jesus is once again not aware of where James, is it James and Jude, right? And I think the implication here, these are his relatives. But yeah, let's take a look at that scene.
So no James and Jude?
Well, they felt it was best to celebrate in Sepphoris while you were here. Just to avoid conflict.
I understand.
And then after this, Jesus also doesn't know that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are in town. Let's see that.
So many people have told me they can't wait to see you. Oh, and guess who is in town?
I couldn't tell you.
Lazarus and the sisters.
What? No.
They got in today. They figured it was a good opportunity to see you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I haven't seen Laz in a while.
And did you know that Jesus was lousy at sports?
Let's take a look at that.
Let's take a look at that.
John just needs to drop one and it's over.
No promises.
All right, here we go. You ready? Easy. That didn't take long.
That's 3. Okay, that's fine. It's just was there and then it. Anyway, shaking the dust off. It's been a few years.
It shows.
We're fine. I'm fine. You're fine. Everyone's fine. Okay.
So there's a lot to think about here. I will say the one scene where Mary says, "Guess who's in town?" It's interesting what Jesus says. He says, "I couldn't tell you." And so it does make me wonder, okay, what would it have been like to have been around Jesus all the time? Now, obviously, if Jesus is always projecting this kind of supernatural awareness, that you can imagine that would be very difficult to accommodate yourself to. That would be very difficult to be around all the time.
Right. I mean, think how often we start off a conversation with a friend. Hey, guess what?
Right.
Oh, I know. I got this.
Exactly. Right. And also the scene where Jesus isn't that good at sports makes me think of some of my boys. My boys they play a lot of baseball and they're really good. And when we have friends over, we have relatives or whatever, and they're playing, especially with younger kids, they'll act like they're terrible. Oh, you struck me out, and obviously I know that they're not doing their best. And so obviously Jonathan Rumi is here acting, he's playing Jesus. So were there times where Jesus would say things like, oh, I couldn't tell you, and, allowed the person to maybe, it's interesting to think about these kinds of situations, but the thing that I just keep wondering about is why is this emphasis on Jesus' limitations overshadowing the sense of Jesus's authority, his transcendence, his omniscience that we really see throughout the Gospels? Make no mistake about it, there are episodes in the Gospels that emphasize that Jesus is fully human. He gets tired. He weeps when Lazarus dies, although he knows what's going to happen to Lazarus, right? And so there are these moments. Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, right? And so these passages have been the focal point of lots of theological discussions because they are so few and far between. So I feel like the balance is on the other side here in the Chosen show. Maybe they're trying to overcorrect where in the past Jesus isn't portrayed as having any limitations, almost like a ghostly figure or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and it is a question of proportion. It's not like, well,
Right.
this is just totally off.
Sure.
But it's fascinating to step back and think about, as you're saying, Michael, the proportion in the Gospels. Like, you'd be hard-pressed to flip to a page of the Gospel that doesn't have some example or demonstration of Jesus' power,
Right.
of his divinity, his authority, his teaching. And so the proportion swings in that transcendent dimension without losing the kind of earthly, ordinary, personal dimension, right? In The Chosen, it swings very much in the opposite direction. Again, it's not like there are no transcendent moments. For example, in the midst of these clips with Mary that we just looked at, and he says, I don't know, I couldn't tell you, this and that. He does know that his time is approaching, right? So it's not
Now,
that,
I wonder a little bit
I know.
about that, right? Because sometimes I wonder, is it the case that Jesus only knows that his time is coming because he knows he's going to do something that's going to provoke
Right.
controversy? So, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. anticipated meeting a violent end, right? Because he knew that he was engaged in something dangerous. Blessed Miguel Pro is another figure like that.
Yeah.
So we could go through the list of others. I just want to think about where the preponderance is and how does that capture what we have in the Gospels' portrayal of Jesus. I'm just trying to compare them to the Gospels. And I do reflect on the fact that my first introduction, and I think yours too, was the first episode where Jesus comes to Mary Magdalene. He knows everything about her. I haven't really seen the woman at the well. There's that episode. There's a couple of other moments where you get something like that. And anyway, it just makes me think a lot about what it would have been like to be around Jesus, and how do we think about the witness of the Gospels and what that tells us about what that might have been like.
Yeah, and another side of this that is beginning to strike me a little bit is in the Gospels, not only is Jesus, I would say, predominantly presented as being the Son of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having this authority. He's also hard to predict.
Mm-hmm.
He is very clever in the best possible way in his argumentation. You can't always, or rarely maybe, can you guess what he's going to do. And somehow in trying to make Jesus a little more, let's just say human and approachable, I think he becomes a little predictable, actually. So some of the other characters in The Chosen, one of the things I enjoy is you're kind of like, oh, I didn't know Mary Magdalene would do that, or Peter would react in that way. Jesus is almost the most predictable, and that's a little hard for me because I think the way the Gospels portray him, he would be surprising in a wonderful kind of way. And as I was sitting with this and thinking about it, it's fascinating because the gospel writers clearly chose the scenes that they wanted to present and how they present it. In St. John's Gospel, he even said, these things have been written. Jesus did many other things, but these are written so that you might believe. And nowadays, it's interesting to me that, you could say, well, the Chosen's trying to fill in some of the things that the Gospels don't have. And that's, I get that. I love that, actually, about it. But it's interesting that we, as a society, let's say, somehow we want to see kind of the ordinary, the approachable, the almost mundane, friendly, meek Jesus. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's fascinating to me that that is precisely what the gospel writers chose intentionally not to convey in the main. So what has changed?
Yeah, Susanna Asakanen, I think is how you pronounce her name, has done a lot of work on characterization of Jesus in the Gospels, and she shows that what the gospel writers are often doing is presenting Jesus as the ideal masculine figure, and that in Jesus's context, masculinity is especially associated with being in control of a situation and demonstrating piety, among other things. And so Jesus in the Gospels is in control of the situation. Even when it seems that he's being acted upon, he's allowing things to unfold, right? And so maybe we could think about, okay, well, if we're going to adapt the story of Jesus today, what are the characteristic traits that people really want men to think about embodying today? Well, gentleness, compassion, we see these kinds of things in Jesus. But I don't know if having such a predictable amount of limitations is also part of that contemporary understanding of what ideal masculinity is.
And don't get me wrong, I enjoy a lot of it. It's just a question of proportion and makes me think a little bit about the character of Jesus. And as we've always said, it sends me back to the Gospels to kind of, draw some contrast, see what's being highlighted in the Chosen series, right? And then what the Gospels is choosing to highlight, and are those differences significant? Is it just an enrichment? These are, I think, helpful questions for Catholics to reflect on, for Christians, for viewers to reflect on as they watch.
Yeah, I just think of the piety of people like Peter in the Gospels. Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And it seems to me that often that sensibility isn't captured in the portrayal of the people around Jesus in the Chosen. But let's talk a little bit more about Jesus then at home and him celebrating. Let's move to talk about the celebration of the Rosh Hashanah, day of New Year. It's nice to see a recognition of an important institution here in the story. Of course, this gives us a little insight into the timeline of the show, the timeline of Jesus's ministry, because of course the feasts would fall on particular times of year. And so it's important to know that the Feast of Tabernacles, which is portrayed in season 2, episode 4, that would take place around September, right? So that is the backdrop for the man who's healed. I think that's Simon the Zealot's brother, right? So that it would be Feast of Tabernacles. And now in season 3, episode 3, we're at Rosh Hashanah. That would be in September of the next year. So we're basically looking at October, September, basically looking at about 11 months, right? From Tabernacles all the way back around. So does it feel like it's been a year since that has taken place in the Chosen? I don't know, something to think about. I might also point out that in the first century, Rosh Hashanah probably wasn't the New Year's celebration that came a little bit later, but perhaps they wanted to play that up because, of course, in the gospel narrative in Luke, Jesus is going to announce the year of the Lord's favor. And it seems like they really want to emphasize that as a new year, like actual calendar year, rather than just a kind of symbolic spiritual new year. That's often been the way it's understood by people. But let's go to the scene then in Luke chapter 4 that this episode is really drawing heavily on. In Luke chapter 4, we not only hear about Jesus going to Nazareth, and in Mark, we read that he healed a few people. That's not found in Luke. What we do see is that he goes into the synagogue, as it's portrayed here in The Chosen, and we read the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And it says, when he unrolled the scroll, he found the place where it was written, which I think is interesting because in the gospel, Jesus is going directly for this passage, where in The Chosen, it was like, well, that was the reading for the day, and you're going to come up with an interpretation of it. And the passage, of course, that Jesus reads from Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. That's important because the anointed one is Christos, Meshiach in Hebrew, right? So The Lord has anointed me. This is a messianic figure to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Isaiah 61, 1 through 2. So this is the passage Jesus reads in The Chosen as well. And we read, rolling up the scroll, he gave it to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began to say to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now in The Chosen, there's a lot more that happens going up or involved in this scene. But what's going on here? Let's say a few things about this. Well, it's the year of the Lord's favor. So the year of the Lord's favor is a reference to the Jubilee year, which is a big deal. It's the year, man, I wish we had a Jubilee year. It's the year you cancel all debts, all right? And in a Jewish mindset, the cancellation of debts was related to sins. We actually see that in the Our Father, right? Where Jesus says, forgive us our debts, and he's referring to sins. So the Jubilee year comes to be understood as a kind of spiritual jubilee. Already in Jesus's day, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see that the future coming of the deliverer, a Messiah figure, is going to be associated with atonement of sins in connection with this Jubilee year. And so then in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus goes on to explain why, he says this. He says, no doubt you will quote this parable to me. Physician, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what we heard you did in Capernaum. And Jesus said, amen, I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own town. Truly, I say to you, that's the same line we saw in Mark's gospel. Mm-hmm. I say to you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout the land. That's a story we read in the Old Testament. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a woman who was a widow at Zarephath and Sidon. That's in 1 Kings 17. And then there were many lepers in Israel at the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet none of them was cleansed except for Naaman, a Syrian. We read about that in 2 Kings 5. When everyone in the synagogue heard these things, they were filled with rage. So they rose up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built in order to throw him down. But he passed through the midst of them and went away. So here we have the basis of what's going on here. And there's a lot that could be said about this, but...
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's helpful is, for those of us who are familiar with Scripture, you can read this and I think you can almost miss the drama of it. Like, this is a life-threatening episode,
right?
You know?
Yeah.
And so for me, it was actually helpful just to see, and some of the dialogue that they added in the synagogue, not in the biblical text, but it was a way of kind of heightening that tension till it gets to the breaking point, and for me, that was actually really helpful to kind of have a more visceral sense of the drama and the tension. I was watching it with my wife, and we're kind of sitting there just kind of like, wow, this is like really tense, and I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because in The Chosen, they want to play up the idea, well, are you the Messiah? Are you? And the key thing in Luke's gospel that seems so offensive is that no prophet is acceptable in his own town, and that is why Elijah and Elisha did these great miracles in Gentile lands, right? And of course, there's a well-known understanding that the prophets were often killed by their own people. And so there is a real edge to what Jesus is saying here in the synagogue that we can understand if we're reading the story carefully enough. But obviously the producers of The Chosen really wanted to amp things up here and focus on lots of other aspects. And in fact, when Jesus says this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing, he is quoting a passage in Isaiah 61 that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other places was understood to be about the Messiah. Yeah. So Jesus is making a messianic claim in Luke's gospel when he reads that passage. So it's not wrong to say that that was part of what was going on there in the scene.
Right. I mean, and it was interesting to me that one thing it brought home was, why does Jesus in God's plan and in his following the Father's will, why does he sort of begin this, if you will, tide of rejection in his hometown? And it seemed that Nazareth sort of stands in almost for the whole of Israel in this way, which, without blaming all of the Jews, we say, right, that Israel rejected the Messiah in a certain sense. And so that was actually helpful for me also to kind of see this microcosm in a way at the beginning that will point to or sort of manifest in advance the larger macrocosm that we'll see play out as the Gospels go on.
Yeah, some Jews reject Jesus and some Jews follow him. All
Absolutely.
the apostles, Mary, they obviously, Jesus' first disciples are all Jewish, but it is a major leitmotif throughout the scriptures that there is a righteous remnant, right? That not all will see. And so this is also true of Gentiles, and it's also true of people in the church. Just because you're in the church doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be saved. And we're going to see even one of the 12 apostles falls away, right? Judas. And we see Peter denies Jesus, and the other disciples have their own failings as well. So one thing that is interesting is in the Gospel of Mark, we pointed out, it explains that Jesus performed some miracles, but not many because of the lack of faith. And this is a major theme throughout Luke, that Jesus performs miracles, and that these miracles are made possible because the people participate in the miraculous work of Jesus by their faith. For example, in Luke chapter 8, Jesus explains to the woman who's healed, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Or later on, we read Jesus say, "Do not fear, only have faith." He says to Jairus, right, about his daughter, "Do not fear, only have faith, and she will be saved." And so there is a need to have faith in order to allow the miracles of Jesus, in order for Jesus to perform miracles. It's not like he can just force his work on you. His work will be made manifest to people who have this gift of faith.
And in particular, the miracle, precisely as a kind of salvific revelation, absolutely presupposes faith, because many people see the miracles and not all of them come to believe, right? Not all of them have faith. And so the miracle by itself is not sufficient. We don't want to say it's not special, but it's not sufficient. I mean, faith is required, and faith is also strengthened and a fruit of these miracles when received in faith.
Right. We saw the analogy between Jesus' miracles and the sacraments of the church, right? You can't receive the sacraments in a way that is efficacious, that matter, right? If you don't have faith. You could baptize an adult, but if the adult is just going through the motions and doesn't really have any faith whatsoever, it doesn't really mean anything, right? And the parents have to supply the faith for the child at infant baptism. Now, so there is an implication even in Luke that there's a kind of lack of faith there, as we don't read about miracles being performed there by Jesus. What do you think about Rafi?
Yeah,
You talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, it was interesting. So Rafi is familiar to us from the wedding at Cana, right? He is the father of the bride, and Jesus performs his first miracle there. So he's on the receiving end of this. I mean, his reputation has been saved. His daughter's celebration has been saved. There's all of this. And now, it's sort of, I don't know, heart-wrenching to see him want to disavow. It's sort of like, yeah, I'll take that miracle. Like, I'll take the favor, but I'm not sure I want to call him the Messiah.
I'll take that favor, but I also support killing him.
Right. And that was hard to watch, and it raised, there was kind of a hard point for me, and then a beautiful point, I thought, possibly, later on. And the hard point was, first it's just hard to see it, but it was hard because one of the themes in the Gospels, and Mary's Magnificat gets at this beautifully, is that it's the lowly who have faith, right? And even we see in the book of Acts when St. Paul is preaching, he goes in front of these crowds, and those who follow him afterward are kind of the ones who accept are the lower ones, right? Often women, which in this context would not have been kind of the noble high class, right? Some of them were. And he's just sort of like, not the riffraff that's following St. Paul, but it's the lowly that accept. And Rafi is among the poor. That's sort of the point of the wedding at Cana and the scriptural passage, but also in The Chosen. And so for him to kind of lose faith, that was hard to see, because it's often the lowly who are called to faith. But then I was thinking about, well, so if in this portrayal, which is not in the Gospels, right, but the specific point, if we want to run with it, it actually can highlight something sort of looking back on the episode of the wedding of Cana, which is if Jesus' miracles take faith, then we might say it's Mary's faith in that episode, right? It's her faith and her intercession that, in a way, launches Jesus' public ministry, that brings about this work of mercy for Rafi and Dinah. And so you have a kind of representative faith, like we were just talking about with parents with respect to children and the sacraments. And so Mary could be seen to play that role. And that was a beautiful kind of later point of reflection for me. But yeah, it was hard watching Rafi reject Jesus. And I get the point of the portrayal. Like we were just saying, no one is sort of so close to Jesus that there's never a risk of turning away, right? And so that comes through loud and clear, with that scene.
Yep. Yeah, another thing I'll just say, for me, a troubling aspect of the Chosen's portrayal was when the people in the synagogue, I don't remember if it was the rabbi or not, Jesus talks about it coming to announce a Jubilee year where spiritual debt is forgiven. And somebody says, we are the children of Abraham. We don't have spiritual debt. And I was so taken aback by this. It seems to be another case where Judaism, where Jewish people are presented as this kind of easy foil. For Jesus, obviously Jews understood that they had spiritual debt, right? I mean, that's why there is Isaiah 61, right? There's a whole passage that's in the Jewish tradition about a messianic figure who's going to come to announce a year of Jubilee. This is why they had rites of atonement. It's why they have sacrifices of atonement, and other such things. Now, perhaps what's going on here is they're drawing from John 8 and John 9, where the religious leaders say, we are without sin. Okay, that's different, though, than saying, oh, well, as Jews, we don't think we have any spiritual debt, right? So I don't know exactly where that's coming from, but it makes me nervous, and I really struggle with that portrayal of it. I will say that part of the reason the people react negatively to Jesus in Luke seems to be the emphasis on the word going to the Gentiles. And in fact, in Jesus's context, there were many Jews who would have thought, well, the Goyim are a lost cause. I mean, there are some that might think that in the eschatological age they'll be included, but a lot of people also would think, no, there's no hope for the Gentiles. They're just a bunch of sinful, as Paul says to Peter in Galatians, he says, we are Jews, not sinful Gentiles. He says that.
Not to put too fine a point on it.
Right, not to put too fine a point on it, exactly. So I think that what's going on in Luke's gospel is Luke is obviously understood to be the author of Luke and Acts, where we read about the Gentile mission. And so Luke 4 is setting up the story of the Gentile mission in Acts.
Which is fitting for Luke's gospel as...
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing that I'll point out is in the Chosen scene portrayal of what happens in the synagogue, what really drives people to take Jesus out, to accuse him of blasphemy, to want to stone him, is not what's said in the Gospel of Luke, which is a little bit problematic. It's like, oh, well, Luke didn't give us a credible story. We're going to give you a more credible story, right? Okay. But Jesus makes a statement that is not found in the Gospels. He says, I am the law of Moses. Now, Jesus never says that in the Gospels. And at first when they did that, I thought, well, why are they amping this up? It's not really the major reason. Okay, but that being said, there are passages in the Gospels where it does seem that Jesus is identifying himself with, or Jesus is being identified with the Torah, with the law. We Also note that in various Jewish works, the Torah is seen as wisdom. You see this in Baruch, you see this in Sirach. The Torah is wisdom in later rabbinic sources, which may present to us traditions that were around in Jesus' day. Wisdom is pre-existent wisdom from Proverbs 8 is identified with the Torah, the law itself. And so it is interesting, in the Gospels, Jesus is identified with wisdom. Let's go to the slides here. This is in Matthew 11. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is sweet and my burden is light." Now, scholars have long recognized here that Jesus' teaching here seems to draw from the book of Sirach. Of course, there are people who are going to say, it can't be from Sirach. Sirach's not in the Bible. For non-Catholic Christians, it's not in the Bible. And for modern Jews, it's not in the Bible, though in the Talmud, it was still being debated, we see. So anyway, in Sirach 51, we read, "Draw near to me, you who are untaught, and lodge in my school. Put your neck under the yoke, and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your eyes that I have labored little and found myself much rest." So lots of similarities here. I'd encourage you to go look at those two Bible verses and read them together. The idea of the yoke was also connected with the law. So the yoke as wisdom, wisdom as law, and then Jesus identifying himself with wisdom. It's very close to what Jesus says here in The Chosen, where he says, "I am the law of Moses." So
Yeah.
yeah.
Great. So all of this then is building really the scene in the synagogue towards taking Jesus to the cliff and the miraculous escape that we see. So let's
That's right.
take a quick look at this clip.
Great.
Know the grief this will bring upon Mary. But as from the law of Moses, whose life and words you have spat upon today, your sentence is death.
Rafi. Adam. Rabbi Benjamin. This isn't going to happen. Not today.
Wow. So, it's a tense scene for sure. And I know we were talking about, and maybe this is true of some of our viewers too, as you're watching the whole episode and you quickly figure out where this is going, you know what's coming, right? And then, so we were wondering, how are they going to portray this, And you told me that you thought you were hoping for some special effects.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in some church fathers, Jesus is presented as gliding away miraculously. So I was thinking, well, this is a good opportunity to use some special effects. But other church fathers do, like Ambrose, do say what we see here. Jesus stupefied them, Ambrose says, and he changed their will, so to speak, so that they were unable to carry out what they wanted to carry out. And so we were complaining before at the beginning that they don't do enough to assert Jesus's authority and his authoritative power, but it certainly built to that here.
Yeah, I mean, I told you that I was expecting like shockwaves, special effects shockwaves. Didn't get that, but but it is, I was thinking about the connection, and this is in line with what you just said, the connection with Mary Magdalene, where he calls her by name before this sort of moment of, or as a part of this moment of authority and conversion in her case. And here, he calls each of these kind of main figures by name before asserting his authority, arresting the crowd.
Because in the Gospels, let's just be clear, what it says is he passed through their midst. So what does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean he just walked through the crowd? Does that mean he walked through them? I was expecting, I'll be honest, Jesus to walk through them, so they blip as he would go through their bodies or something like that. That's what I was expecting, but they're just lots of different ways to present it and lots of different ways it's understood.
Yeah. So, it's fascinating to see how they ended up coming to the end there. And for me, looking at this whole episode, just to kind of wrap us up, I look, and as I often have, I think, at different responses to Jesus. And it's a great, kind of examination of conscience, I think, as a disciple, to always keep in mind the possibility and sometimes, the actuality of rejecting Jesus in some way, and seeing that. And then even as a point of contrast, the figure of Lazarus, whom we didn't talk about too much, but he is a friend of Jesus. And even in the sense of a disciple, he's faithful to him, but it's hard for him. So even when we don't sort of go the route of rejecting Jesus, we participate in those hardships. We struggle through the Christian life. And Lazarus, I think, in how he's struggling to kind of find his way through these tense events, maybe gives us a model of the Christian life and how staying close to Jesus can be really difficult. And so we need a lot of courage.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining us as we've commented on this episode. We just wanted to share these thoughts with you. We're glad to have had this time. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to the next time we'll be able to talk about The Chosen together. Thank you, and God bless.